July 1945. Darling, I'm now in Germany. It's odd to be here, crazy to walk down the once Nazi streets, thinking humdrum American thoughts. Only the children are really unchanged. They race around the streets, clamber in and out of the bomb ruins, beg for chocolate, and generally behave like any children anywhere. We're beginning to see more and more German soldiers now, walking home in their stained Wehrmacht uniforms. They look exhausted and dirty, and they walk stooped over and avoid our eyes. The people hate us. There's no question of that. I don't think we'll have much luck in converting these people to democratic thinking. To them, our attempts at education are American propaganda.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well, thank you. It's another incredibly beautiful day in Los Angeles.
Oh, yeah.
I feel very lucky that I'm here, although I'm leaving tomorrow for New York.
Oh, what are you doing in New York?
Well, I'm coming back for the screening. And,
right, for the Queens World Film Festival.
And also because we're finishing a whole bunch of, the end of the year for IndieCollect is always about trying to finalize the batch of restorations we have going. The fantastic thing about digital restoration is how much you can do, but the downside is that you can just keep doing it. Not like,
it's a double-edged sword.
Yeah, taking the film to the lab and that's that, processing it, and you're not changing that print after it's come out of the lab. But with digital, you can keep tweaking, and we sometimes, we finish a film and it actually premieres in a big theater, and we decide we want to do a few more tune-ups.
Yeah. I understand that's a very, common sort of situation to be in whenever you can continue to improve, quote unquote, or tweak something. Is it's very hard to know when to stop. Exactly. Usually it's a deadline, or you just run out of money. One of the two.
Well, we will. I just feel as though, because we're generally probably the last people that are going to restore a film like this for very, very, very many years, that I always feel as though it's worth taking the extra time, even if we haven't budgeted it. So that's kind of my modus operandi, is to just really hold ourselves to the highest standards. But it's a constant, it is a constant struggle. You're up against the algorithms that are used to do things like digital dirt removal that are getting better and better, but they still require a lot of monitoring, because they can mistake something that's actually meant to be in the frame for dirt.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
You have to go back through and really meticulously exercise quality control frame by frame. It's really quite it's a meticulous process. It really is. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, how did you want to conduct this? Because I'm getting astray already.
Well, I'm part of my job is to help that, in case we need to. So don't worry about that. But you did a nice intro in the sense that you brought up a couple of the different topics we're going to hit on. One is father and your uncle together were involved in this project, though, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, which is called Filmmakers for the Prosecution. Also, just get out of the way that it will be having a screening, and I brought it up just so I had all my facts at my fingertips. At the Queens World Film Festival on Thursday, November 3rd at 7 o'clock. And you yourself are also getting a nice little accolade as the Spirit of Queens honoree.
That's true. That's true.
By the Catos, my friends Katha and Don and their team. They're very nice people.
They are real visionaries, and they're so passionate about bringing the diversity of Queens to the screen and bringing the films of the various diasporas to the screen, and as well as the films from the countries of origin of the members of the Queen's diasporas. So it's
right. For those, just to tag on to what you're saying, for those who don't know, Queens is, and by the way, where I grew up, that's probably why Kath and I remain friends because of our connections. But you know, Queens is possibly the most diverse you know, place on earth in terms of the sheer number of different ethnic communities that live there. And you know, you could, as they used to say, take the 7 train through and just you know, enjoy that.
Really true. When I first moved to Queens, which was 2006, I was drawn by the fact that on my first visit to the neighborhood where I ended up getting an apartment, I saw people in their national dress on the streets, whether it was, you know, saris or Tibetans in Tibetan monks. It was just startling to me, and I gravitated to that. I mean, you can see I'm wearing Mayan clothing at the moment. It's really it's such an extraordinary community. So I felt right at home there as soon as I landed in that neighborhood, because, you know, I wasn't born in the United States. I spent most of my early years abroad, and you feel in Queens, you feel as though you're part of a world community. And that sort of suits my own personality and history.
Right. Well, tell me a little bit more about that. Actually, that's good. Maybe even a better place to start is tell me a little bit about your growing up. And you said you weren't born in the United States, so. Well,
I was conceived during the Berlin blockade, when my father was working on the completion of the Nuremberg film, and he went straight from that. Now, this is the original Nuremberg film about the trial, right, not Filmmakers for the Prosecution.
Not sort of the
making of film,
which we were kind of talking, which we were referring to before, but the actual Nuremberg content during the trials.
So he was sent. Both he and my uncle worked for John Ford, the movie director, who was head of the field photographic branch of the OSS. The OSS was the Office of Strategic Services, our wartime spy agency. And when they were developing plans to hold this international criminal trial to indict and prosecute the top Nazis that they had been able to capture, it was decided that they would try to introduce an element of motion pictures as evidence. And that led to both my uncle Budd and my father Stuart being sent to Germany, joined by various other members of this little OSS field photo team that was called the War Crimes Unit. And they were attached to the Office of Criminal Counsel of Justice Robert H. Jackson, who was acting as the chief American prosecutor at the trial, even though he was actually a U.S. Supreme Court justice.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, he was a sitting Supreme Court justice.
Wow.
And this was the first time that such a situation transpired, where he was essentially furloughed from the court, right, when chosen by Truman to lead the prosecution. He was furloughed from the court for what turned out to be a year in order to go to Nuremberg and create the whole legal structure that was required to handle these prosecutions. So not long after that was all planned, and the legal groundwork was laid, this little team of OSS officers was sent to Germany and to some of the territories that had been occupied by Germany to try to find incriminating motion picture evidence. That's really the genesis of both these films. The first film being Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, that became the official US government documentary about the trial.
Count one, that all of the defendants participated as organizers or accomplices in a common plan or conspiracy to commit crimes against humanity.
The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored.
It's hard for people now, where we live in a completely media saturated environment.
Yeah.
Hard for people now looking back to realize that, although television had been invented, most people didn't have televisions. And therefore, the only way to see news was through a so-called newsreel, which were film newsreels. And
in movie theaters.
In movie theaters, correct. And, when the trial opened, which it did in November, late November, we're coming up on the anniversary very soon, late November 1945, there was kind of a flurry of newsreel coverage, but very quickly, the press lost interest in the trial because for many people, it was excruciatingly boring to hear these documents read into the record and translated simultaneously. So it was a very protracted process. And that's ultimately why Jackson, who realized he was kind of losing the attention of the world, chose to actually advance the screening of the first film, which was called Nazi Concentration Camps. It was shown at the beginning of the second week of the trial. It had been planned for later. And that really did shake up the courtroom, and it had an impact on the defendants themselves. It was extremely dramatic. My father and uncle both wrote and talked about the effect of being in the courtroom and seeing these images on the big screen in the courtroom, and watching the defendants' reactions to that. So motion pictures, apart from their legal importance, and this was quite an innovation because motion pictures had never been used as a form of legal evidence before. So apart from the importance of them as legal evidence, there was just the emotional impact, the visual impact. And that's what, so to go back to this sort of slightly complicated chain, after the trial was over, my father, who had been part of the original OSS field photo war crimes unit, was asked to come back and make the official documentary about the trial, which is called Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today. And then flash forward, 75 years later, Jean-Chrstophe Klotz approaches me about making a film about how those films were found, how they were presented in the courtroom, what impact they had, the making of the film about the trial, which incorporated that footage, and then the suppression of that film.
Right.
So that film, the new film, which is going to save me a whole lot of time explaining all this.
Filmmakers for the Prosecution.
It's called Filmmakers for the Prosecution. Yeah. Yeah.
So, right, so there's so in the tribunal or the trial, the prosecution presented film that German Nazis shot, which was an amazing parallel to the January 6th committee, because they took the same tactic. Obviously, I don't think they knew about what we're talking about. It's just a coincidence that they realized that using the the content directly from the people that were in the riot, that were rioting, was going to be far more effective. It's exact same strategy. It's funny. And so we have that content, and then that was shown to the courtroom and to those being prosecuted, the Nazis. And then you have the film of the trial itself that came out shortly after. And again, that was really important in terms of how quickly it came out and how it was edited. One thing that I think I had no idea about, which also was very fascinating, was that they didn't have a good video, or they ended up using, but they had lots of good audio. Do I have that?
Yeah,
so they ended up editing some of the video from a different day, in order to make it more interesting. Didn't they have to do
yes. We can't, by the way, we can't use the word video. That's, I think, confusing to people. It's
sure,
really,
go ahead. Thank you for correcting me. Go ahead.
It's film.
It is film.
There were 3 camera positions in the courtroom to film the trial. However, the trial lasted almost a year, and we're still trying to figure out why only about between, let's call it 35 hours of footage was shot in the courtroom. So it became very difficult for my father and his editor, Joe Zigman, also part of the original OSS team. So they knew a great deal about the trial. They knew a great deal about the motion picture evidence because they had assembled it. What they didn't know that much about was why and how it was decided to shoot on which days, because their unit was originally supposed to actually take care of filming at the trial, but they were so busy. We found a memo from Budd to the Office of Criminal Counsel saying, we just cannot take responsibility for filming the courtroom proceedings themselves, because we're still working so hard to assemble all the film evidence. So filming in the courtroom was turned over to the U.S. Army Signal Corps. And, unlike the OSS team that had German speakers on its as part of its
Right.
team, I'm not sure that the cameramen spoke German. I don't know. We really don't know how they were assigned what days. There were major moments in the trial that they didn't capture, including all of Jackson's opening
Remarks.
statement. They did capture a bit of that, but not the whole thing. And so when my father and when Stuart Schulberg and Joe Zigman had to make this film about the trial, yes, they were forced to use picture
Images.
that might have been shot on a different day from the audio that they were using. The whole trial was recorded, so in all the the various languages, and so a full audio recording exists of the trial, and they made creative use of that. But that's why when you see the original film, and Josh Waletzky, my partner in the restoration, we didn't change a frame of the original film, but you can certainly see occasional shots where the voice is telling you one thing because that's accurate to that moment of the trial, but it may not match the movement of the lips because they didn't have the picture to match the audio. And this is what they were up against. They did the best they can. But
Right, and again, there was probably some level of pressure to make sure that this had a lot of impact for those who were going to see it. And of course they did achieve that.
well, let me respond to that though, because you
Please.
mentioned earlier that they had gotten it done so quickly, but actually they weren't able to get it done so quickly.
What was the films though that you said? I was under the impression, and again, I need to be corrected. That's great. But what were that they had to like release something during the early weeks of
Those were the films that they were under tremendous pressure to find and assemble what ultimately were two films that they showed in the courtroom. The first one being Nazi concentration camps, and the second one, which was entirely composed of films shot by German cameramen, called The Nazi Plan. But the film about the trial was much delayed by the politics. It was completed, it was premiered in Germany 2 years, almost to the day, 2 years following the end of the trial. But that was a long time. I mean, the Russians beat us to the punch with their own film about the trial, which they managed to premiere in New York City. And that gave rise to a headline about the Reds beating the Yanks, with the sort of story of the Nuremberg trial. And then ultimately, once Nuremberg, its lesson for today, was completed, the Secretary of the Army decided that it should not be shown to American audiences, so it was essentially suppressed, and people never saw the official version or the official film about the trial until Josh and I restored it. And they never saw it in theaters, that is, until Josh and I restored it and showed it at the 2010 New York Film Festival.
Wow.
At which point it also went to the Film Forum, and it played in cities around the country to extraordinary acclaim and a huge amount of surprise from critics and journalists. And that whole process of researching why it had been suppressed and what had happened to it was part of the fascinating journey that I've been on all this time.
It's a wonderful story, though. It's an amazing story.
It kind of keeps unfolding.
Yeah.
There's more. There's still more to learn about it. And one of the amazing things about this new film, Filmmakers for the Prosecution, is that Jean-Chrstophe Klotz, the director, and his research team found footage of my father, which I'd never seen before.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, with no audio, MOS, but footage of him obviously explaining to a little group of people that they had to hunt for these films to present them in the courtroom, and they actually reenact in this little bit of footage. They reenact, finding film cans in a haystack, finding film cans buried in the soil of a field of crops, and I know from reading my father's letters that this was in fact accurate, that they found film in all sorts of unexpected places. So this was quite exciting, and this footage is, they just found it kind of by chance 2 years ago. So that's what
you had never seen any moving images of your father, right?
No, I haven't.
Right. And
he was, he was 20, about 27 at the time that this footage was shot.
So amazing that in such a position. And a couple of things first of all, your dad, I was surprised looking a little bit more into his career, just how quickly he became so politicized. But it makes sense maybe at that time, the amount of the patriotic fervor, and wanting to do as much as you could for your country at the time, coming out of that period in the 40s and the 50s. And
well, they both were. They both grew up in a family. My grandfather, B.P. Schulberg, who was head of Paramount Studios in the 20s and early 30s, and his wife, Ad Schulberg, they were very progressive. They, unlike a lot of the other studio heads who were much more conservative, they were today we would call them lefties. And my grandmother Ad went to Moscow.
Libs.
She went to Moscow very early on, and so their three children, Budd, Sonia, and my father Stuart, the youngest, they really grew up in an atmosphere of intellectual ferment and tremendous, commitment to social justice and equality, and I think that both Budd and Stuart, well, Budd, Sonia, and Stuart all considered themselves, I would say, socialists, and then Budd ultimately chose to join the Communist Party and become a kind of organizer. So that was the this was from a young age that they were very socially committed, and that was really thanks to their parents, who were very, very progressive.
I'm also, the more I read and am introduced to stories like this, and your father and your uncle's story, is just how early on the military realized that it needed Hollywood, though, in order to sell a lot of what it was doing, or maybe just on a practical terms, in terms of getting it filming in whatever theater, military theater, and it's there's a long history of that.
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole concept of propaganda is propaganda, started with texts propagating the faith back in the 14. I mean, this idea of propaganda comes in some ways out of the Catholic Church, actually, but propagating the faith, and the tools that were used were in the beginning were tracts and leaflets, and as during the Revolutionary War with the famous Paine leaflets and so on, and then as film developed as a way of still photographs were used, of course, to bring attention to poverty and social injustice and racial injustice. Stills were very powerful tools. And then, of course, motion pictures. So, and I think one has to also recognize that on the German side, on the Nazi side, you had incredible propagandists like Leni Riefenstahl, who were, and Hitler himself, he was brilliant at staging these mass demonstrations that were then also very effectively captured on film and used as propaganda. So I think the American propaganda effort, which was, pretty late to the party, because there was so much reluctance in the United States to go to war again after World War I. But yes, you do see finally the US government and the studios beginning to cooperate on the development of series like Why We Fight. But you also have to remember that the studios were also very reluctant about this, because Germany was such an important market, and for a very long time, I mean, up to practically up to Pearl Harbor, they really didn't want to produce anything or write anything or have any movies made that were that were confronting the fascist threat in Germany, because they didn't want to alienate Hitler and kill off that market. I mean, it was a classic conundrum of, you know, one's morality versus one's economic interests. And there's a lot of, there have been some very interesting books, Hitler in Hollywood, and the collaborators about exactly that, which is part of this, also part of this story.
Right.
You know?
Yes, I've also read extensively about John Ford, and it was like somebody like him who was maybe one of the most popular, if not the most popular film director at the time in Hollywood, that he was really had a passion for one, you know, for military, wanted to be a war hero, you know, he wanted that status as well. So I'm sure it was through that, also his own passion, you know, and ambition, that he helped that whole process along, you know.
Yeah, there were many creatives in Hollywood who wanted to play a part, you know, play their part during the war, whether they were Jewish or not.
Right. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Or being, you know, classic, raised in a very Catholic family, and Jews as well, and many of them wanted to work on the propaganda side or as war correspondents, and their talents were put to use that way, either in intelligence or as the OSS film unit made training films during the war. Mainly, that's what Budd and Stuart did during the war. It was only immediately after the war that they were sent to Europe. So they were in many ways very fortunate. They never were in harm's way, you know, compared to many others who both, you know, never mind the, you know, the grunts, but other people who had come out of the film industry and were sent over either because their commissions sent them there, or they were enlisted men. So Budd and Stuart had, you know, they had what you might call a very cushy position back in Washington, making training films for our OSS spies.
But still doing very, very essential work, inarguably. Just one last note about Filmmakers for the Prosecution. We know again that it's having a screening on Thursday, make sure I get that out, the 3rd, coming right up this Thursday at the Queens World Film Festival. Is it
at the Museum of the Moving Image? Yes.
Right at the museum. Thank you. And is the film going to just have it continuing a educational distribution, or will it? How people will it have a broadcast?
Well, I'm delighted to tell as many people as I can that Kino Lorber is going to release it in theaters along with Nuremberg, Its Lesson for Today, a kind of double bill.
That's
So
great.
you'll be able to see both films back to back, and they plan to release it in a number of theaters. We'll see how many theaters they can book, and then yes, and then the whole panoply of other platforms, online platforms, Blu-rays, DVDs, which is still an important part of the market.
Yeah, that's Kino still has
Yeah,
one of the distributors that continue to manufacture Blu-rays and DVDs to their audience, to their Now let's talk a little bit about your other passion, IndieCollect, because this is also one of my passions. So I was really excited to have you on here to talk about that. Can you tell me a little bit of history?
the restoration of the first Nuremberg film really led directly to my sense that I had to start the IndieCollect campaign, because during the process of restoring Nuremberg, which was from a 35 millimeter element, we made a film to film restoration. I learned a great deal about film restoration. I was very lucky that, you know, the head of the Academy Film Archive, the heads of the film division of the National Archives, the head of the film division at the Library of Congress, the head of the German Film Archive, the Bundesfilmarchiv, and of the National Archives of Holland, they all, in a way, took me under their wing because they realized that this was an important project, and that as a working film producer, they also understood that I understood filmmaking, and I think they had confidence that I was going to do this and do it right with their help. So I was very fortunate, really very fortunate that I tackled this when I did, which was with already almost 30 years of film production behind me. And along the way, I realized, wow, who's doing this for my generation of filmmakers? Who's doing this for the post-war generation, the 60s generation? I mean, the generation of us who grew up making films on 16 millimeter and 35 millimeter. What's happened to all of our negatives? Where are they being held? Are they still accessible? And this, the more I looked at my own situation, the situation of my colleagues, I realized that although, you know, tremendous work was being done by Marty Scorsese and the Film Foundation, and by the Academy Film Archive, by the UCLA Film Archive, by the Museum of Modern Art, by the Library of Congress, that for none of these places was saving American indie films the top priority. So, because they were doing foreign films and Hollywood films and, you know,
the canon,
the entire canon of world cinema, of which we represent a slice, but I would argue a very, very large and important slice, but from their point of view, just one, you know, one segment. And so I discussed this with the then heads of the IFP West in LA and IFP based in New York, and said, you know, I think we really have to tackle this. And while they agreed, they just felt they didn't have the bandwidth to take that on, because they're both, it's now the Gotham Film and Media Institute in New York and Film Independent in LA, but they were still very focused, understandably, on helping, you know, younger filmmakers get the financing they need to make their films, get them out, advance their careers, etc. So that was when I decided I really had no choice but to launch what I decided to call IndieCollect. And we weren't able to really get started until I raised my first major grant, which came thanks to Darren Walker and Kara Mertes from the Ford Foundation back in 2014 for $200,000. That enabled me to put together a tiny team to start this process of figuring out, you know, where people are holding their films. And right away, I realized in talking with Irwin Young, the chairman of the Duart Film Lab, which had been kind of the preeminent indie film lab, that a huge amount of material was right there at the lab, much of it abandoned, with the filmmakers not realizing that their films were still there, with the lab being unable to reach out to filmmakers because The original records would include an address and a telephone number, and a company name, but not necessarily a person's name. And these companies were all, of course, defunct. So
Yeah.
the challenge, I mean, Irwin Young thankfully decided to allow IndieCollect to come in. We actually set up offices on the 12th floor in the middle of the vault. And we began, with his help and with the help of Steve Blakely, who'd been the vice president of the lab for a long time, in charge of the wet lab division. We began to go through what was ultimately about 5,000 films, about 50,000 cans of film and sound.
Wow.
And, some names were very obvious, like Miller's Crossing, the Coen brothers. Okay, we know how to find them. Woody Allen, Spike Lee. But there were many, 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 many thousands of films where nothing on the can told you who had made the film, or even perhaps its ultimate title. You're trying to search existing databases to figure out what a film is. And we
sort of have to be detectives.
Exactly. We became trained detectives during the process. We ultimately, thanks to the Academy Film Archive and the UCLA Film Archive and the Library of Congress, primarily, we managed to find homes for about 3,500 of these negatives. In some cases, they were taking films that we had not identified, with the understanding that they would continue to process them and try to figure out what they were. And that if a filmmaker showed up and, after we'd done this and wanted the film back, we would happily, either IndieCollect or one of the archives would return the film to them. But when that did happen, and it did happen in the subsequent years, they were just so thrilled that we had, saved the negative and the other elements and put it in a safe place on their behalf. So this was a 3-year process. We did have to leave about 1,500 negatives behind because we just didn't have enough information about them to find the right home for those elements. And I think that Linda Young, who took over the lab, is equally concerned about those elements. I think the Academy Film Archive is going to take a bit more. And then, we hope to find room for the rest. But we have, so as part of that process, we developed something called the IndieCollect Index, developed by Israel Erzman, who was on our team, and which is a very, very sophisticated database that enables you to not just describe the film and who's in it and who made it, to the extent you can figure that out, but also to describe every element, whether it's negative, or an interpositive, a dupe negative, a magnetic track, an optical track, prints, etc. So we're able to, and then we barcode everything, and we're able to keep track of it in the IndieCollect Index. Then in 2016, thanks to the Weissman Family Foundation, we were able to acquire our own scanner. And that became an essential part of IndieCollect's mission, is not just to rescue films, but to actually restore them. And then we like to say reactivate them, which is the third part of the process, and that is to get them back out for audiences to see.
Yeah.
So this is
what it's all about in the end, isn't it?
What? Yeah.
That's what it's all about at the end of the day.
Exactly. The point is to convert these film gems, which are on celluloid, which can't be projected anymore because theaters shifted over to digital projection in finally I mean, it was a process, but I would say finally about 2013. And so unless you have a new good looking digital version of your film, it's not going to play in a movie theater other than in one of the few places that still is able to show film.
Right.
So, and shout out to Quentin Tarantino, who's about to renovate his second LA theater that's only going to show film. We're very supportive of anyone's efforts to continue to shoot on film and show films on film. But the reality is that if we're going to if we're going to make important American independent films that were made over the last 50 years accessible today to audiences in online platforms and in theaters that are only equipped to show digital for digital projection, then we have to create these new digital restorations. Otherwise these things become lost from view, which effectively means lost. So that's my campaign. That the whole IndieCollect team is focused on helping you as a filmmaker find your original film elements, moving them to a safe archive where you won't have to pay for storage and where they'll be properly kept for the long term, converting them, i.e. restoring them in a new digital format, and then helping you get the film seen again. We're trying to sort of be, all things to all indie filmmakers. And then there's the question, which is part 4 of this, which is what is going to happen to your film after you die? Because this is, these films, if we've done our job right, these films will survive you. And yet then you have to also put into place a series of arrangements that are going to ensure that your film remains accessible after you're no longer around, or after I'm no longer around to take care of it for you. So that's another part of the process, what we call legacy planning.
Right.
Yeah, making sure your film legacy, forget your house and your car and your furniture, but your films are incredibly important.
Yeah. It's a great story. And it's a great organization that you created. Can you just name maybe a couple of recent or?
Yeah, there's, we've done over 50 restorations, and one of them that I'm very proud of is a project we undertook with the Academy Film Archive called Cane River. That was directed by Horace Jenkins.
Oh, funny you mentioned that. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I know Oscilloscope was in on the distribution of it. But yes. I had his son on my podcast, Sasha, because he's got a new documentary about Louis Armstrong. And so I just had Sasha on, but I had already seen Cane River when Oscilloscope was releasing the new master. Yeah. Amazing.
Well, I just saw Sasha's film, Louis Armstrong, Black and Blues, Friday night, and I just think it's a magnificent film, absolutely magnificent.
And coincidentally, to come full circle, Sandra, all that audio, all those reel-to-reel audio tapes that Armstrong kept at his home in Queens, another Queens story. It just keeps folding back on itself. This
and I've been to his house several times because I love taking people to Louis Armstrong and Lucille Armstrong's house. It is such a gem, and to be in his little office where he had all the recording machines and all the tapes is just, it's magical, and it's very poignant. And I think Sasha he really just did a brilliant job. This is the film that Louis Armstrong deserved. And I really want everybody to see this film.
Yeah, well,
And
I'm going to
it-
send you a link to my conversation with him.
Oh, great.
Maybe on your flight tomorrow you can watch it.
Well, and that reminds me of another magnificent film that we restored called Jazz on a Summer's Day. One of the most difficult sequences to color correct and restore was actually Louis Armstrong with Jack Teagarden. It's a magnificent piece of the film. But because of the lighting, the red lights on the stage, and it was really challenging to restore that film. But I think our colorist Oscar Miarca did a great job with that, and that premiered at the New York Film Festival 3 years ago. We're just completing we did Melvin Van Peebles' first film, The Story of a 3-Day Pass, which I think is an extraordinary film. We're just finishing A Question of Color by Kathy Sandler, which was one of the very first films to deal with, with colorism, with prejudice, not just in the white community, but also in the Black community.
Yeah.
Regarding the darkness of your skin. We just finished a magnificent feature film by Jim McKay called Girls Town, with Lily Taylor and Ingenue Ellis and Brooklyn Harris and Michael Imperioli, and it's such a powerful film. It did make a big splash at Sundance when it first opened, when it was first finished, but I think it's going to delight and shock and surprise people when they see the restoration, which is fantastic, looks fantastic, I have to say. And that colorist was Eva Yuma. And we're just finishing a wonderful film called Tokyo Pop by Fran Kazui, which will be finished in about 3 weeks, I hope. There are just so many great films that we're working on. It's
so exciting.
I feel just so privileged and lucky that I kind of, became an accidental archivist in the course of this whole thing. And in a way, I do have to credit my father and mother and uncle, because if I hadn't dived into the challenge of getting Nuremberg restored and back out, I might have just kept on, producing movies instead of completely shifting my attention to worrying about the older movies getting lost.
Well, and thank you for doing God's work. Somebody who has been doing for like 11, 12 years now a show essentially around independent film and getting stories out there into the world and helping champion these storytellers. This is a great thing. So I have to hold you to a couple of promises. One is that you will take me to the Armstrong House Museum at some point in Woodside, or Astoria, right? Astoria. No, wait, where is it? Corona.
Yeah.
I should remember that because Sasha also corrected me. And then my high school girlfriend was from Corona, so I used to go out there. Who knew at the time? Wow, Louis Armstrong's house is right there. But and then the other thing would be I need to come see the IndieCollect offices or something.
Oh, we'd love to give you the tour and let you sit in on a restoration or watch the scanning going on. It's just every day is exciting, because you're with film restoration, with scanning and film restoration, you really never know what you're facing until you've got the film on the scanner and you're seeing really what's happened to the color, because we can physically inspect the film and see how warped it is, or and measure how much it's shrunken over the decades, but you can't really determine what's happened to the picture until you get it on the scanner. And that's when we start to see okay, is this going to be relatively easy one, or is this going to be really, really tough? I mean, when we did George Romero's kind of long lost film, The Amusement Park, there were only 3 surviving prints. We had no what are considered master elements, the negative or the inner positive or the dupe negative. We had only these very deteriorated prints to work from. They were incredibly badly faded. And I think our colorist Anastasia Tupolev, working with George's widow, Suzanne de Rocher Romero, I really think she pulled off miracles, and it looks pretty fantastic, especially if you had seen the condition of the 2 prints we used.
Right.
So it's very, very exciting to do this work, and I also believe that these are films that have stood the test of time, even if they got lost for physically lost or lost from view for 20 or 30 or 40 or sometimes 50 years, but they seem new in a way. To me, they look new, not only because they've been newly scanned and restored, but they feel new because you see them in a different different perspective from when they were first made, and they, oddly enough, they feel incredibly relevant. So that's what's really gratifying about this work.
Well, another promise will have to be a part 2 to kind of get into even more into the weeds around IndieCollect. I know that there's so much I want to hear about, and I think that people that are interested in this podcast and would definitely be very interested in the work you're doing. And thank you so much.
Do a podcast from the restoration suite if you want.
That's a good idea. I think we should do that.
Invite you in to meet everybody and see how it's done.
I'd love that. I really would love that.
Thank you so much for being interested, Adam. It's this is a very rarefied. I mean, movies are not a rarefied world, but the people who are interested in saving movies and the process that's a pretty small community, and you're doing something very valuable for us, and that is trying to interest more people in not just in the final object, but in the process of how we get there, how we save them, how we get them back out. And finally, it's also about film literacy. What do people know about their own country and their own culture and their own history, and how is that shaped by the films? So if you can't, I really believe that independent films give you another kind of mirror of American society, and if that's lost, then you're seeing a kind of truncated view of America.
Well, I mean, it's a good argument for why you should see a variety of types of films from different cultures and different times, because it's all at the end of the day a history lesson. And I talked to Larry Kardish around this festival that just happened up here where I'm in the Valley right now.
He's wonderful. Yeah,
right. I mean, talk about somebody who's doing God's work. But Larry had said pretty much the same thing you just said, and he was very inspiring to talk to as well. I mean, but you're really an inspiration, Sandra, and I can see as you talk about this work how much you love it and your passion for what you're doing, and it's wonderful. I really would invite you back on anytime you want to come back on. I would love that.
Thank you so much.
And the Queens World Film Festival is lucky to have you on Thursday. And
I want to make one point about the screening at the Museum of the Moving Image. And that is that we're incredibly lucky that Eli Rosenbaum, who's one of the main characters in the film, is coming from Washington to speak after the film. Eli, he doesn't like to be called.
He has the last word, in fact, in your film.
He does.
In the Klotz film, excuse me.
Yes, he does, and he was known as a term he doesn't much like, but he earned it. He was known as America's top Nazi hunter for 40 years because he headed the Office of Special Investigations at the Justice Department. But in June of this year, he was named by our Attorney General to be the chief war crimes investigator for Ukraine. So he has a whole new job now.
Wow.
And that relates absolutely back to the Nuremberg trials, because there were ultimately 13 Nuremberg trials. And he's going to be able to talk about his current work in Ukraine and how that relates back to the Nuremberg principles, and how he sees the ongoing quest to try to hold people accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I really urge people, this is a very rare opportunity to sit in the same room with Eli Rosenbaum and hear him talk. It's going to be quite special.
All right, well, I'm going to promote the heck out of it, the screening and
Thank you.
the event, which is
Thank you.
a better, more apt description of what's happening Thursday night. It's an event. And thank you again for making the time. I know you're a busy person. And so it means a lot to me that you came on here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam.
All right. So have a great rest of your weekend.
I hope to see you in New York soon.
You will.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you.
Mhm.